Okay, happy Wednesday, happy hump day, everybody. Thanks for joining us either here in the Zoom or on Facebook Live. We'll be having conversations regularly throughout the rest of the year about all sorts of abolition topics, and we wanted to start with radical self-care. It's a super important topic. I think a lot of people are struggling right now and have been for a while. And so we have our incredible director of programs, Samia, and our amazing mental health manager, I don't know everybody's titles, Ace, who will be leading us through some amazing education and all the things. They're fantastic. So listen to everything they say and do it. Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction, Nikki. So yeah, I am Ace and I am the mental health and wellness manager. It's a lot, it's a mouthful and hard to remember even for me. And I use preferably no pronouns, but I'm also good with all pronouns or they or any pronouns.
And I'm Samia. I'm the director of programs and I use they or he pronouns. And I'm very excited to talk about radical self-love and care today with Ace.
I'm going to start off with a nice big swig of water for my own self-care.
There you go. Hydration is very important.
My giant jug of water. So yeah, today we just wanted to have like a dialogue about radical self-care and what that means to us, and would love to hear from y'all who are watching on Facebook Live or who are here in the Zoom room with us. Any questions or thoughts or comments or things as they kind of come up organically. We want this to be a really organic discussion just about like what we're doing, how we're taking care of ourselves, things we've seen folks really struggle with and how they're trying to take care of themselves. Because I think that, yeah, this is, from my perspective, this is really hard work. And if we're going to be able to do this hard work, we have to prioritize care as well in it.
Yeah, sustainability is super important. And I think that without that, you may be able to do the work right now, but for the long term, we need you there for the movement. So folks need to do self-care in order to be there.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start by defining self-care or how we see self-care.
Yeah, I love that. So I know for me, self-care is about what do I need in order to function, but also like on a spectrum from like just basic functioning to like thriving, right? And that whole spectrum of needs that I have, being able to meet those needs, because at that level of like, if I am individually thriving, then my community can also thrive, my people can also thrive, like I can be investing the most and making the most impact for those around me because I'm thriving.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that real self-care, like outside of this kind of like capitalist like way that people define self-care, I think self-care has become really co-opted, especially in the past few years, by corporations that are like, buy these bath bombs, like buy this journal from us, like this is self-care, here's a self-care,
it's a candle.
$50. Yeah, exactly. And I think that self-care has become this thing around like indulgence and like luxury.
Treat yourself.
Yeah, and I think treating yourself is important, right? But that is like only one small part of self-care in the way that I see it. And I feel like self-care ranges from so many different things. I think self-care involves, as you mentioned, taking care of the individual to take care of the community. And I think the community is actually really important in self-care and is often like left out. And so I think that when I think about self-care, I think about, yeah, those different levels of self-care as well. Like I think sometimes people don't see it this way, but distraction can be self-care depending on what the situation is. Or like, you know, zoning out can be self-care. You know, there's also all these other ways to do self-care, and it's not something that has to cost a lot, and it's not something that has to take a lot of time. So I think that those are some misconceptions that I feel like happen around self-care.
What you said about like the capitalist framing of self-care really resonates with me. I think that in some ways, that version of self-care really serves capitalism, because it's like, keep yourself so on the edge that you have to do these really indulgent things to feel good again because you're overworked, you're overtaxed, you're not really investing in yourself, and you're not investing in the relationships that you have that are like mutual investments. You're tapped out by capitalism. You're being stretched to your absolute breaking point. And so like the only way to rebound from that is to then invest more in capitalism to get some of that, like that treat yourself mentality is very much like use capitalism as a tool to feel good because capitalism is destroying you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like what you just said really brought to mind for me that like I think it's like a meme or something where like someone is asking the corporation like, hey, can I get like less work to do because I'm really overworked, and can I work like only 40 hours a week and not 50 or 60? And the corporation's like, here's a self-care webinar. Right. And so
Would you like a stress ball?
would you like a stress ball? Like we can give that to you, or here's like a kit from Bath and Body Works, like here's all these, again, more capitalist things that actually feed into like consumerism, which feeds back into the system. And rather than looking at what do people need holistically to take care of themselves, right? Which involves not being burnt out, which involves not working ridiculous hours or being like overly stressed, and having enough time to spend, as you mentioned, with your family or community members or building those relationships. And capitalism doesn't really allow for that.
Yeah. And I think this is a really like global moment that we're having where this problem is like coming to a head, and we're seeing all of the different fractures in the system, I think more clearly than in points in the past. But I also think some pieces of this are just like so uniquely US culture and the way that our system is designed to really just keep us on this like very edge of survival, no matter what like level of I'd say most levels of the socioeconomic hierarchy. I think most of us are right on the edge, and that's the design, is to keep most of us right on the edge. And it's only like a very few people who are actually at a place within the capitalist system that they're encouraged to thrive.
Yeah, or they even have enough time to actually be able to take care of themselves in the ways that people use self-care, right? And I think sometimes, I think what people often don't talk about is if somebody's working multiple jobs, is super stressed out, just doesn't really have a lot of time for themselves, sometimes actually giving them that space, or like having that space to think about their circumstances can sometimes be a bad thing, because sometimes it's like, oh, hold on a second, I'm being exploited by all of these organizations that I'm working for, and I'm still not making a living wage, and I'm still don't have the time to do these things. And sometimes that can actually be like a really hard thing for people. And I think that people don't acknowledge that when they talk about oh, self-reflection on your situation is so important. It's like, yes. And also sometimes people are in really bad situations, and self-reflecting on that just makes them feel worse about the fact that they're stuck in that,
Yeah, and I think when I tie that back to the purpose of self-care for me, I think kind of within this work, within movements, is if we're just giving that space of self-reflection in this individualistic way of oh, now I have time to reflect on how much I'm being exploited and how much all of this sucks and how terrible my situation is, that can feel really disempowering and really disorienting. And people start to get to this point where it's hopelessness sets in, right? So how do we reorient that to let's reflect on collectively how exploitative and fucked up this whole system is, so that collectively we can empower each other and leverage our collective power to then make change, because that can feel like I'm getting somewhere, I'm doing something.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that self-reflection can be a good thing in the sense that it might mobilize people towards action and towards being, as you said, working collectively to change the system. And also, if you don't have the ability to do that, right, or you don't have the power to do any of those things, it can, as you said, feel really disempowering and really disorienting. So I do think there's a balance there that I think people don't, at least the corporations, when they're talking about self-care, are definitely not mentioned. It's take care of yourself so you can come back tomorrow and work ridiculous hours again.
Yeah. Rather than take care of yourself so that you can realize that we're exploiting you and come back in mass with collective power and fuck our shit up.
Yeah.
That's what they don't want.
That's what they don't want. And I think that's how self-care is actually really intertwined too with like labor justice and like labor rights and things like that as well, which I don't think is often talked about, like when people think about self-care.
Yeah, we also have a comment here in the chat, especially self-reflection without the time and ability to process the tools and the resources to heal.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't have the things that you need to then take it deeper and to actually do something about it, whether that is personal healing or community healing or community power and collective action, that can be, yeah, super damaging to just like unpack all of this stuff and then have nowhere to put it.
Yeah, I think it's the unpacking part that can be really, really difficult, right? And that needs, as you mentioned, and as Nikki mentioned, like the time and space to be able to process through that and all those things. Because I think that everyone can engage in self-care on some level, but like I said, sometimes distraction is self-care depending on what was happening in your life, right? So sometimes if you're really stressed out, burnt out, overwhelmed, sometimes like reading a novel that takes you to another world can be helpful, or watching a movie that like immerses you in someone else's experience can be something that just like helps you just like take a second and move away from the difficulty that you're having in your life. And that's totally valid too.
Yeah. So we've kind of like teased right around the edge of this several times, but I want to take us deeper into self-care versus community care. Like, where are the points of intersection between those two things? What's the difference between them? What's the value and the role of each of them?
Yeah, I think that community care and self-care are like this, right? Like I think they're like totally like intertwined, right? And I think that the environments that you're in are really important for your ability to care for yourself, right? Again, like we were mentioning before, if you're in really unsupportive environments, toxic environments, abusive environments, it can be really hard to actually take care of yourself in a holistic way. You may be able to do things to make you feel better, or like, tamp down like the responses you're having, but you're not necessarily going to be able to reach a holistic sense of well-being when you're in these really difficult environments, right? So I think that in that sense, taking care of the community and the community taking care of you is like this, the same thing.
Yeah, I have found that some of the most like powerful healing experiences in my life have been moments of not just personal healing, but moments of healing with others through relationships and through like having like hard discussions with folks that I love and care about, and like pushing us collectively to like this place of deeper connection, right? Because it's not just something I'm doing on my own, where I'm going into my own like vulnerable and dark places in isolation. It's going into those places and realizing like, I still love you and you still love me, and we're still a community together. We're still, whatever relationship that relationship is, like we're here for each other and we have each other, can be like a really like hope infused way of going into some of like the hard, that unpacking that hard stuff. So if you have that community that can do that with you, you can get to these places that are otherwise like untouchable sometimes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's a comment in the chat about asking whether we mean like community care or collective care, and community being sometimes inaccessible to people. But if we're looking at it from a collective perspective, it means by taking care of us first, we can take care of others too, just by showing up for ourselves. So I definitely want to touch on that. I think that I completely agree, right? I think that it is important to be able to take care of yourself in order to show up for other people, and that you can access this collective sense of togetherness without necessarily being in close community with a lot of people. I think especially during the pandemic, people have been feeling really isolated, really lonely, realizing that a lot of their connections or community that they felt was their community is not showing up for them in the ways that they wanted. And I think that something that I think comes with when we talk about community care is the way that capitalism, and especially I would say ableism too, really cuts people off from the ability to make good, close, deep connections with people. Because as you mentioned before too, if you don't have the time, it's really hard to do that. I think ableism, or the inaccessibility of community spaces, can make it so that a lot of disabled people just are not even able to actually get to the spaces to have community with other people. And so I think like, I agree, community can be inaccessible, and I think we should also look at why that is.
Yeah. Also, I think that when we are forced to, when we're pushed in situations to really like question our underlying assumptions about why something isn't accessible to someone, we find that it actually can be accessible, right? That the inaccessibility was just because it's too hard, it's too much work, it's this extra layer, it's too much money sometimes, it's whatever. But it's like, if you build that into a system, then it no longer is too much, it's just part of the system. And that, I think, is a tension that we're at right now, of like, we have an inherently ableist system that we're trying to do things that are not ableist in, right? Like, we're trying to push back against that ableism within a system that is like structured in a way to cut off people and to remove access from folks.
Yeah, and I think that the pandemic has been such an interesting, like, almost like view of that, because in some ways it's made things more accessible for people because you can just be sitting in your house and you can attend community events, but it's also made things more inaccessible because people that were going in person and don't have internet access or computers or phones or whatever, like, are now struggling to actually find and be able to be in community. So there's this weird way that we almost like switched it, where the people before who were really struggling to be in community are like now more able to do so, and other people are now not able to do so. So yeah, I feel like that's been an interesting thing as well.
Yeah, I think there's also this other piece that's like, the medium of access is also a barrier in and of itself sometimes for folks to be able to show up. I think I've seen a lot of folks trying to like process what this means, but like showing up to Zoom meetings all day long is so draining, and people can't quite put their finger on why. Like, why do I feel so like empty after these like endless Zoom meetings? I think there's a lot about like in-person interaction that's lost through this medium, and that especially for certain folks, and I think again this is an ability justice thing, that like some folks have a harder time and have to put a lot more effort into like being able to regulate all of those different pieces, and figure out like how to be in the space.
Yeah, and I think that yeah, in some ways I think that we have like lost those connections, or it's been really hard. I know for me, like especially when I met people off Zoom that I've only seen on Zoom, I'm like, this is such a weird experience. And I think in the beginning of the pandemic, I think what was really interesting is like people were really responding to the pandemic with like, let's hold all these virtual events, like virtual, and it was good. And also at a certain point, I think people got on overload. Like I think people, as you were saying, were like, specifically I'm talking about people who are working from home and on their computers all day. It's like you're literally on your computer for 8 hours, and then it's like, let me go to an event now. No, I just want to go to sleep. Like I just want to be away from a screen. And I think that we've almost, during this, it's been very difficult to have community while being away from a screen or technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So from your own kind of experiences with self-care and community care, like how has that, like what environments have really supported you to care for yourself, and what environments have like prevented you from caring for yourself, and like how does that then impact how you're caring for your community? That's like a lot of questions, but
no, I hear you though. I feel like honestly, I feel like I've been in very varied work environments, where I've been in work environments where it's like super strict. If you don't show up, like I used to be a waiter, right? And it's like, that's one of like the work, right? It's like, you can't even call off sick without like finding someone to replace you, which just like really sucks. And then you're also just like on your feet all day, and it's tiring. Like they don't even let you sit down or like sometimes eat for really long periods of time, which is just very restrictive environments that are just terrible in terms of like taking care of yourself. It's like you can't even drink water for several hours half the time, right? And so I've been in environments like that. And then I've also worked, like Black and Pink does this, and I've also worked at another healing justice organization where I was given a lot more space and room to actually be like, this is what I need. Like, here's a time that I need off. And like, this is super helpful. Like at Black and Pink, we do unlimited pay time off for full-time employees. And like, that has been amazing, right? It's like, if I need a day because I'm just feeling terrible, like I can actually take that day and not feel guilty and not have to think, oh my God, I'm like using all my sick days and I like need them later. Like, what if I get a fever? And just like having all of these thoughts about that, just being able to know like, oh, I can actually relax and I can actually take care of myself, and tomorrow I can come back literally better because of that, right? And I think that that's something that I've really learned in being in healing justice organizations and environments, is like, when you prioritize relationships over the work, like the work happens, the work gets done, the work flows from that because you're prioritizing the people that are behind the work, right? It's not like work all the time. If you need some time, you can actually take it. And I think that for me, it's made me more productive. It's made me more motivated to be productive too. Specifically thinking about like, if I need time, being able to take that makes me actually value the organization I'm working for more, because I'm like, oh, you believe me, like you trust me to do this work, you know, believe that I'm worth it, you know, like all of these different things. And it just makes you way more motivated and happier as a person. And I think that I honestly think, even if we're talking almost from a capitalist standpoint, organizations are losing out by like not doing that, you know, because they're actually having higher employee turnover and people are really dissatisfied with where they work. And that's horrible, obviously, for many reasons. But I think that it's actually really beneficial to prioritize people's care of themselves.
I want to uplift in the chat. We have, yes, when you prioritize relationships, the work just happens.
Absolutely.
What
about you,
want to share in the excitement over that little moment that you had. I think that that within like this like corporate capitalist world that we kind of exist within, you see how like even orgs that have realized like, oh, when you trust people to just do the work, when you let them set their own hours and let them figure out what works best for them and give them sick time and give them space and give them resources and things, that you the results are there, that like you get more actually. Those organizations that have figured it out, many of them have also still created this like very like classist divide of like, well, that's for these folks. That's for the higher level, higher paid people of the organization. And we literally don't care if the frontline workers, the essential workers, turn over constantly, because we don't value them as people. We only value them as bodies. There's like real fetishization of folks who are on the front lines of labor, that like, you are just a cog in a machine, you are replaceable, you have no value, and you're not allowed to take space for yourself because that would make you a person.
Yeah, and like even the racial dynamics of that too, right? Like the frontline workers are almost always Black and brown people, and the upper level managerial class or whatever workers are almost always white people. And so it just furthers that even more.
Yeah, it allows for that dehumanization to happen on those multiple levels along not just class, but race lines, and reinforces it.
Yeah.
I have worked for places where there was like this lip service paid. I think this comment that we also have in the chat as well is very similar to this, but like there's a lip service that is paid to self-care. It's an encouragement to take time for yourself, to use your PTO if you need it, to take time off, but then the culture is constantly contradicting that. So I remember there's a couple of places I've worked within public health where it's like people above me in the organization are constantly saying how I should engage in self-care, but when it comes down to their self-care needs, they're very publicly not meeting them. Right. And like it's almost like this display of like, well, I'm sick, but I'm still working. Or like I never take my PTO. I always sell it back if, for places that actually will buy back your PTO. Like just these ridiculous practices that are almost like, and they're talked about in this sort of reverent way. And then it's like, well, obviously you really value people not caring for themselves.
Yeah.
You value the idea of it, but not the practice.
Yes, totally. I think that there's like this way that not caring for yourself and overworking yourself is actually rewarded, right? And especially at like corporations and these different organizations. And I remember distinctly the story of this woman I used to work with. She told me at her last workplace, her boss was literally sending emails while in labor at the hospital and was back to work within 2 days of having given birth. I mean, like that's a sort of, and it's like, if you're telling people to take time off, but then the actual practice of it is the people who are higher up doing that, like that's not encouraging anybody to feel like they can actually take the time that they need. Like if you were sending emails while you were in labor, then I can't take a day off because I have a cold. So
yeah. And even if I can, it's a choice that, like, if I ever want to be where you are, I have to sacrifice these things. I can't both care for myself and advance within this organization. And like, so the choice is like, okay, well, yeah, I can take my PTO and I need to take my PTO. Nobody's actively like telling me not to or punishing me for doing it.
Right.
But it's very clear that if I keep doing it, I'm going to keep making, $10.35 an hour.
Yeah.
And barely be able to feed myself, like.
Right. No, totally. And I think also there are some places where they say like, oh, take your PTO and whatever. And then even if there's no guilt, or even if the culture isn't such, it's like the amount of work that you have actually means that the entire time you're off, you're like, I can't even be off, like, because I'm thinking about, oh, if I take today off, then I'm gonna have 20 more tasks to do tomorrow because I didn't do them today. And I'm on all these deadlines that are like totally unrealistic. And when you do that to employees and tell them to take time off, it's still contradictory. Like you have to have a sustainable amount of work in addition to the timing of work as well.
Yeah. And also I think that's where like using that community care lens can come in, even within the structure of an organization, of like, how do we make sure that we're caring for each other in intentional and active ways, so that if one person needs this, whatever it is, whatever thing that person needs in order to be okay, how do we all kind of collectively move into that space to make sure that everything doesn't fall because of it? Like if I can't show up for 2 weeks, somebody said abolish bosses, yes.
Also that, if we want to talk about hierarchy as well, because that feeds into all of this as well.
The entire, and I see this in so many organizations where the entire role of a boss is just to like manage other people's work and not to actually do anything. Like you don't have a real job. Like your job is to make sure that other people stay oppressed. Like that's a whole thing that could just not exist. And then you could free up that whatever resource that is creating that person could be freed up to be the person who like helps other people to take time off and care for themselves and things like that.
Yeah.
Like work in sustainability on the organizational group level.
Yeah. And I feel like what is like super weird about the hierarchy in organization sometimes is like what we were just saying of like, if your boss or somebody above you in the hierarchy is like not taking care of themselves at all, and like, that kind of sets a standard. But also sometimes it's the opposite, where the people in leadership are doing almost nothing but demanding like high amounts of work from people below them, or pushing their work onto people who are below them in the hierarchy, and the people below them don't feel like they can even say anything because they're worried about getting fired or getting punished or whatever. And so there's this weird way it can be like either or sometimes, or sometimes both, honestly.
We have a great question here in the chat. What about if we're in an org and we don't have the power to shift or change anything? How do we care for ourselves in that situation? I think that's a great segue into our next area, which is just like, what are our actual self-care practices? What are things that we're doing, things that we can do to care for ourselves, to care for each other, to create, even if we're not in an organization or in a place where we have this like structure of a group, to kind of forge that for ourselves with the people that are around us?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. And also because that is often the case for people, right? Is that they don't have the power to shift or change anything. And I think that, one of the most important things in those situations is knowing what your limits are, right? Like at what point is this just overboard? I can't take it. I need to start looking for another job. I need to, figure out something so I can get out of this environment. At what point is it toxic to you, right? And I think that like having that knowledge is helpful, because then you may not stay beyond your boundary point, right? Or you may like try to find something else or figure something else out, like if you are hitting that boundary point. Also knowing that sometimes that's not actually possible for people who are in jobs where they're not able to leave, or they just like need to keep those benefits for various reasons like healthcare and things like that. And that can be really hard too. But I think something that can be important is knowing those boundaries.
Yeah, for me, I think that just on like the most basic level, that we always have power to do something. that there might be lots and lots of things that like are the first things that pop into our mind that are super inaccessible. I don't have the power to make any changes within this structure that I exist in. My job is my job. I can maybe find another job. I maybe can't. I can maybe, ask for something and actually be heard at this job, or maybe I won't. But I exist within some system where I can make some sort of change. And so if that is as simple as like creating mutual aid with your neighbors, creating like structures of people you already know to help each other out, to just make sure that folks who are in a bad place at a particular moment are cared for, so that then when you're in that bad place, you're cared for. And it can be that simple. It can be about just even like sharing information with each other, because lots of the like existing things that are out there to try to help people have tons of barriers and are really hard to access for folks. Like they put as many obstacles in the way as possible. So like just figuring out on a basic level, can I even just talk to other folks about how to access this, how to use this existing resource to my own benefit and not have it become another obstacle for me. And really just like reorienting ourselves to like, what is my community and who can I help and also be helped by? And starting to like break down some of the shame around that, because like that shame exists to keep you from reaching out and helping each other and actually building solidarity and building power.
Yes, totally. And I think that I think there's a balance. I'm thinking about like advocating for yourself in workplace scenarios. I think there's a balance here, right? Like sometimes people are so afraid of saying anything that they actually never even ask, and the answer might have been yes if they asked, right? And then there's also times where they know that if they say anything, they will get punished, they will get fired, right? So it depends really. It's so relative to people's situation. But I totally agree with you that I think one of the most important things is thinking about, like, I think it's called power mapping, right? Where you're looking at how can I actually create change within this organization? And sometimes you can look at who's on the same level as me, right? Can I talk to them? Are they experiencing similar things? Is there a way we can band together and lobby to create changes within the organization? Will we get fired if we do that, right? Like I think thinking about all those things can also be really helpful, because there is power in numbers, right? And I think that if you can get more people on your side, then I think it can be possible to create some changes.
Yeah, within groups and within communities, I also think this is an important part where we need to talk about like the role of intersecting identities and struggles and privileges that happen. So like you might be trying to make change within your organization and have more or less privilege than somebody else in the same group who's trying to do the same thing, and like leverage that. Like part of mutual aid has to be leveraging the access that we do have. And it might not feel like much, but it's like when you put that into action with a group of people and you pull those levers in the right places, like all change that has ever been created has been created that way.
Right. And it's thinking about like who will actually be heard, right? Like who, when they actually say something, maybe listened to and not actually punished for that, right? Maybe seen, because oftentimes, as we know, like something coming out of the mouth of one person will be like, wow, what a great idea. And something from another person is like, that's like dumb. Why would we do that? You know, like things like that.
Or stop complaining.
Yeah, stop complaining, right? You're always like mad about something or whatever, right? And so I think, yeah, being honest about that and also like leveraging those privileges. I think too often why people are not willing to speak up in situations where they actually like would be able to get something done or would be able to like advocate for something without facing any punishment. So then it falls on the Black and brown people who are often like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I actually really need this job and I probably will get penalized if I do say something.
Yeah, we have a local nonprofit here that recently was able to make some big changes, A, because there were some white folks who were willing to take some risks, and B, because like folks worked together and they were strategic and clever and thoughtful about like how they brought folks in to this group that was like, that built a structure out of like, there are problems with how we're doing things here and we can't keep doing them this way. And I think that there has to be some risk to make these changes, and you have to think about who can bear that.
Yeah, and I think what's hard is, I'm thinking, since you brought up that example, I'm thinking about an organization where I am, where they fired a Black person for literally no reason, right? They fired a Black person. This was a long line of like horrible things they had done over the past several years. Everyone was fed up. Everyone was tired of the executive director specifically. And the ask was for her to step down, right? And literally every employee got up and walked out of the office and was like, we're just not doing this. But the wild part is they actually fired every single one of them instead of getting rid of the executive director. And the executive director is still in that position. So I think I say all that to say that sometimes even when you leverage all of that power, it still won't work. And I think that it's important for people to also know what they're dealing with, right? Like what sort of organization are they working for, and what are the risks and what are the things they're willing to lose. So
yeah, and sometimes just to be really planful, I mean, just say that.
I'm not gonna call them out.
I think that it's important to be planful around those things as well. So I think again, like shifting to these different lenses, I think it's important to think about like, what is my self-care? What is my community care? What is our collective power? What is our different lenses that we can look at the situation from to make sure that we're really being strategic about all of those. So like, we're going to do this action, we're going to all walk out because whatever, nothing is happening, nothing is changing. And they might get rid of this executive director, or they might fire all of us. If they fire all of us, how do we help each other survive and get new jobs and, make it to the end of the month even? Like, do we have a food pantry that we set up, or like local resources that we know we can tap into and we can like all of us go and access if we need to? I think planning for some of the worst case scenarios sometimes is really important.
And I also think that the harder part of this conversation is, I think, people needing to think about their like class privilege as well, right? Like there are some people who can lose their job and they would not actually be in a horrible financial situation, and they may have enough money to last them a couple months, sometimes several years, right, depending on what sort of financial situation they're in. And there are other people who cannot like stand to not have another paycheck. And I think if we're really going to talk about mutual aid in a very real way, we need to talk about wealth redistribution too, right? We need to talk about, what does it mean that I have enough to be able to, survive for this long, and someone else doesn't even have enough for the next 2 weeks? And what is my responsibility as a person who has this much, And I think that is something that a lot of people don't really want to think about, because I think people want to hold on to their money a lot of the time. But
and that's like how it's designed. Like the system is designed for all of us to think about us and ours first, and not to think about each other as community. It doesn't give us the opportunity to develop that community, to really be willing to put ourselves out there for each other. And that's the part that we've got to break down when it comes to community care.
Yeah,
I'm looking at time, and I do want us to get back to like personal individual self-care practices as well, because that is that foundation that we're going to build this collective power and the ability to even do community care off of.
Yeah.
So I'll say that some of my most important self-care practices, like my number one is boundaries. It's the ability, like even when something feels like I want it and it might be fun and it might be good, to know like where I need to draw my lines, and that I have to like hold that line even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's like, this feels sometimes even like socially a little bit like painful to draw this boundary and hold this boundary right here. But like, no, this is what I need for me, because if I don't, the ripple effect is, down the road, like I can't function.
Right. And I think there are so many different types of boundaries too. There are like personal boundaries for yourself. Like what I'm thinking of right now is, a lot of times in self-care, there's this idea of like pleasure, just like enjoy yourself. And like, that's what's important. And if people can take that to an extreme, right? And sometimes it's like, oh, well, I'm just gonna, drink every night because it feels good, right? And it's like, at a certain point, I also have to tell okay, what is actually good for me and what feels good? And sometimes those things are different. Actually, they're more often different than people would think, I think. And I think that a large part of self-care is prioritizing what's actually good for me, not just what feels good.
Mm-hmm. And I think I want to circle all the way back to the beginning of something you said of like, sometimes things that don't like fit into the category of self-care can actually be very good for us. Like disengaging from things that you can't think about right now, and just, maybe not forever, right? Like there are certain things that can have an impact on us long-term if we can't ever engage with them. But like, if I can't do this right now, just setting it aside and not thinking about it, distracting myself from it, just trying to move away from it as much as possible, because it's too much right now. I don't have the resources and the tools and the space right now to be able to process that.
I will say, like, I've personally found that practice really, really helpful. Like, there was one time where I got really, really bad news when I was at work, and I was at a workplace where I could not just like tell them what was happening and leave. So I just, in my head, I went to the bathroom and in my head, I was like, okay, because that was the only place I could sit and think for a second. I was like, okay, I got this really bad news and I have 5 more hours of my shift, so I can't actually like deal with it right now. So I just like imagined myself like taking that news and just like putting it aside. And I was like, I have time tonight and I'm going to pick this back up tonight. Right. And I literally tried to just put it out of my head. And then when I got home, I was like, okay, let me pick this back up. And I just immediately started crying, because it was like a moment where I had let myself move it to the side and then come back later. And I think that what you're saying is so important, because compartmentalization can actually be really useful as long as you come back later. Because if you don't come back later, it will just get absorbed and then you'll just have it in your body oftentimes and you won't even like know that it's there and it'll be hurting you. So I think being able to come back to it at some point, doesn't have to be that same day, but knowing that you need to come back to it also.
Yeah. And while like pleasure can be a really important element, I personally am very much into pleasure activism and the importance of pleasure in self-care. I think that when we notice like we're out of balance because one thing is like we're driven just towards one direction and not towards other directions, oftentimes that's like because we're not giving ourselves the space to actually deal with some of these things. Yeah. So like in that example, if you had set it aside and not given yourself time to come back to it, you might have kept dealing with that problem by like, I'm just going to drink every night. It feels good. It feels better than dealing with this problem. And unfortunately, like some folks feel like they're in a situation where they have to handle it that way. I do think that even in the worst situations, there are resources that exist if we can, again, collectively like help each other to find those resources and to tap into those resources to be able to deal with stuff. But like, it can feel so inaccessible. Like there's so many steps between where I am and being able to even just like process what just happened. That how do I get there?
Yeah. And sometimes it will take months of you being in a space where you're not really processing anything before you can get to a place where you actually have the time and space to process it, you know, and sometimes it will take that long. And that's okay. Sometimes things come up, you know?
Yeah. What are some of your other personal self-care practices?
Yeah, I think for me, something that I found really helpful is, I definitely agree with you, boundaries are super important. And I think that boundaries have been personally a hard thing for me. So I have worked really hard over the past several years to set boundaries with other people is like one of the hardest things for me. And so I've worked to say, okay, this is the most I can do. I can't do this. I don't want to do this, even though everyone else is doing it, you know, things like that as well. And that has been super helpful. And I think another thing I've done for self-care, honestly, is just like trying to journal as regularly as I can. For me, I think what was helpful for me was identifying that I'm not like an internal processor. Like some people can just sit and think about something and they'll like come to a conclusion, and that's like awesome, and I envy that. But I like either have to like say it out loud to someone else, or I have to write it out, or I have to do something externally for me to be able to process through stuff. So for me, I found like journaling to actually be super helpful as a way of moving through hard things that I'm going through and identifying solutions. And then I guess like the part of self-care is like the journaling helps me identify what I need to do, and then doing that is the self-care. So, and that sometimes that is just like, you know, I just need to not think about this for a couple of days and I'll come back to it, right? And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm going to deal with this right now. I'm going to have this conversation. I'm going to do what I need to do. I'm going to set this boundary, whatever.
Yeah. I think another important piece for me as you were talking about that, it made me think of like, how do I even know how to like set boundaries? And like backing up from that, it's like prioritizing like what I really want to invest my time and energy into. So, you know, part of it for me is like my work can be really impactful if I give it the space to be really impactful. If I if I pile too many things on my plate, like as a therapist, I can't really show up and engage with people. So it's like, that's one of the areas where it's like, no, I know I need not just the time it takes to actually sit with this person and sometimes like be in the worst, most horrific things that have ever happened in their life with them and help them get through it. But like also the space that I then need to process it, the space I need to document it, the space I need to like just like to actually even just like come out of it and distract myself from it and move on with the rest of my life. I need to build all of that in intentionally and not like just give it this space. I think that's something I used to do a lot, is I would just give it like, oh, that appointment is an hour, so I'll give it an hour. Oh, I have to, then I started realizing like, oh, I have to do these other tasks around it. So I'll give it a little bit of a buffer. But like when I started to really realize that like that's the path to burnout, and that I'm not actually going to be able to show up for the people that are really important to me to show up for, then I started thinking about it really differently and saying like, okay, so what are the most important things for me to show up for? Who are the most important people for me to show up for? And how much time and energy do I actually need to do that consistently and meaningfully over time? And that helps me to set boundaries so much better, because I was like, oh no, the top things in my list is like the people I work with in therapy and my family and like these couple of like important things that I do like other organizing work around, and like that's it. Everybody else, like when I'm overtapped, like everybody else is gone. Time or space for you.
But that's important to know, right? And there's like nothing wrong with that. Like I think that when people think that they can prioritize every single thing on their plate at the same level, it's just like not realistic, right? And I think something that I've been thinking about that I want to mention is like, I feel like as we've talked about this, we've really kind of just like moved around this topic of healing justice. So I just wanted to kind of like name that more specifically and say that like healing justice specifically came out of organizers and movement workers who were burning out at just like ridiculous rates, right? And people were like, what is going on, right? Like what's happening and how can we fix this? And like, what about our culture is making this happen? When you think about movement work, and this is still unfortunately mostly the case, movement work is usually unpaid, right? After hours, people are usually working their own job, and then they're going to do organizing work or, you know, on the weekends or whatever. And the general consensus is if you care enough about it, you will make time for it, right? Like rather than like, hold on a second, like, I need to maybe take a nap. Like I need some rest time, you know? And so this idea that you have to be working around the clock for the movement as well. And that if you don't, there's like something where you just don't care enough. And I think especially like
you're not really invested.
You're not really invested in the nature of a lot of movement work, which can be reactive, right? Oh, this huge thing happened and I'm in the middle of a super busy week, but like we need to like stage a protest, or we need to release a letter, or we need to mobilize people to like respond to this. And like, that's not sustainable in the long term for people, right? Like you cannot always drop everything that you're doing to be able to do these things. And sometimes I think that's where this community care aspect comes in too, is like if we're functioning as a more cohesive unit, the people who have the time can do that. And then the people who don't have the time don't feel pressured to. And then that can switch around depending on who has capacity when. And I think that's part of like sharing that burden of self-care and care generally as well.
Yeah. I love that more and more movement organizations and spaces are moving towards like incorporating into the time that they dedicate to working together, like dedicating some of that time to actual healing work, dedicating that to things like centering practices, and even if it's just this small piece of it that is like, here's a moment to actually like we all chipped in and we got food, and feed yourself, and we're all going to just take a moment to really like to be in this moment with each other and be mindful and like reorient from all of the stress of our lives that we have been doing all day, or you know what I mean? All these like little practices I think can really build up to a community that is actively engaged in caring for itself in a way that like people are able to sustain much more at that level than if like the pressure and the demand is constantly there. It's like we were saying before, like organizations will probably never figure out that especially like corporate organizations will never figure out that they're missing out actually on people's potential when they actually are nourished, when they actually are cared for. But I think that like our movement spaces can't fall into that same trap. We have to recognize that people are able to give more when they have more.
Yeah, and I love seeing that shift over the past like several years, whereas before it was like really not like that at all. And I feel like now it's been like really shifting to like, let's make sure we have food at every movement space that we have. Every meeting we have, we make sure to have food. Every meeting we have, we make sure to like ask about accessibility before the meeting, right? Make sure folks can actually get there, you know, and holding space for people at the beginning too. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What things are coming up for you? And holding spaces also for processing grief and trauma and all these other things that come up in movement work, rather than before where it was just like go, 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 go. And if you don't, you're like not committed. So.
And also like so many people are now also orienting themselves towards community accountability processes and recognizing that like we all are born of this system of harm. And so in many ways we are replicating harm and creating new processes to address that and to actually like repair relationships where harm has happened, to actually repair relationships and invest in those relationships to be able to keep our communities and our groups together, rather than allowing them to like split apart because somebody has perpetrated some type of harm. And it can be such a huge range of things, right? Like everything from like violence to like just thoughtless words.
Yeah.
All of that is harm that is breaking apart what could be like really powerful communities. And instead we're like replicating these harms that have been done to us and then falling apart.
Yeah, and I think like similar to how like transformative justice is trying to move away from the prison industrial complex and these like kind of carceral systems that are meant to deal with harm, and moving that like I would say like responsibility onto the community. In a lot of ways, I think healing justice is trying to do that too, where they're trying to move away from the medical industrial complex, which is harming a lot of people, right? And this is not at all saying that like people cannot rely on the medical industrial complex. Similar to the police, we often don't have alternatives at the moment. But I think part of what healing justice tries to do is move that into community spaces. How can we take care of each other? How can we make sure that if someone's having a health crisis, they can actually just call a friend who's able to assist them because they already are trained on how to do that, right? And I think like these movements are, I mean, all the movements are super connected, right? But I mean, thinking about moving away from the burden on the state to moving away to moving to the burden on the community, not burden like negative, but like the responsibility of it happening on the community instead of something that's not working for us in the first place.
Yeah, because so many of the harms that are perpetrated by those systems, the medical industrial complex and the prison industrial complex, are all perpetrating harm on the basis of dehumanization.
Yeah.
And so the community is inherently so deeply humanizing that it's like, yeah, sometimes we still harm each other, but we also still see each other as human. We also still see each other as valuable. And I think it's easier in that context to stay in a space of like, all right, here's something that could be an opportunity for harm to happen, but it also could be an opportunity for healing to happen.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's a really fine line between those things. Like I've seen lots of situations where it's like, if you had just gone to the system for help on this, like it's easier for them to just like put a label and put a box and move on with their lives and make it easier for themselves without actually getting to the real root of like knowing you as enough as a person to really understand why you're suffering.
Yeah, and I think a lot of movement work, honestly, is just like seeing people as individuals, seeing people as humans, seeing people as like their full potential of like who they really are. And I think that in a way, like ableism does that, where there's this idea of like wellness, of like who is actually well, and like anyone who doesn't fit that, you have to be fixed, right? You have to be put on some medication, or you have to be fixed in some way to like be a normal person, right? And I think that's the same way when people think about jails and prisons, right? People are often thinking about, oh, you need to be fixed, there's something wrong with you, you're like doing all these harmful things, when we know that that's not really the reality in either case, right? And just being able to see people as who they actually are and not comparing everyone to some like norm, which is actually based on like a white cis straight man, right? So yeah.
And asking instead questions about like, what does this person need?
Yeah.
And what resources do we have to be able to try to meet those needs? How do we try to create an environment in which this person doesn't need to be fixed, but the environment is fixed?
Yes. And seeing people, as you said, as individuals, asking them, what do you need in this situation, right? And that goes across the board. And so often people don't do that, right? People are just offering solutions or giving them whatever is available, and like not actually sitting and taking a second and saying, hey, how can you feel better in this workspace? How can you feel better in this movement space? How can you access what you need to access to take care of yourself, and all those different things that often don't even get addressed.
Yeah.
I wanted to address this comment in the chat, which I realized a second ago. Someone said, I've been thinking about how self-care can sometimes be prioritizing monetarily, like dishing out the cash for a therapist or mediation training over the short-term distraction things that are sometimes necessary, and how it doubles as community care, learning the tools to all deal with our own traumas, etc. Yeah, I think that self-care is often the way that we see self-care, all these things like therapy and like trainings and like things like that can also be really inaccessible financially for a lot of people. And what does that mean? Are we telling those people that they cannot take care of themselves unless they're able to access these things?
Yeah, and unfortunately we have just like a just horribly designed system in which, particularly around mental health, where like the folks who are in need of the greatest mental health care are the ones who have the least access to it, and vice versa. Like the people who have access to the most comprehensive, holistic mental health care are folks who usually don't need that level of care, who probably would be just fine with like what is usually offered in like a community mental health setting, which is a lot less individual personalized care, because they haven't trauma and adverse experiences map so perfectly to like all of the outcomes in our lives that it's like the person who has experienced the most harm in terms of their mental health is also probably suffering the most in terms of their financial well-being, in terms of their physical well-being, in terms of their social well-being, all of these different things, and then don't have the resources to access it. And so I do think that like really rethinking how do we create healing, especially around mental health within our communities, how do the folks who can access those resources access them and bring them back to their community in a meaningful way. Because like I love therapy, I'm a therapist, I think it's great for folks who can access it. I think everybody should be able to access it. And also I know that like there are so many therapeutic things that exist that are not therapy, that are not part of a mental health system, that can be replicated by anyone. If you learn some of the principles of it, like you can then replicate that within your family, within your community, and those relationships, because they are real organic relationships like that have developed over a much longer period of time than a therapeutic relationship, can be so powerful and so impactful.
Yeah, and like can include creating support systems, creating support spaces to process things, peer support, like all these things that aren't actually things that cost money and don't necessarily require extensive training, right? But can actually be really, really helpful for people as well.
We have another message that came in. All right, so it looks like we are getting to the end here. I don't know if you had any last thoughts or ideas that you wanted to touch on before we go.
Rest is resistance, like resting in order to be able to do the work, and also just because it's important to rest. Resting, hydration, do what you can, don't push yourself too much, and also take care of yourself.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. How about you, Ace?
I think that I really want to just go back to like, we all have different levels of access, and oftentimes we have so much more than we give ourselves credit for. I think that the system, the imposter syndrome is created by the capitalist system, and we have that imposter syndrome to keep us like limited and boxed in and to not realize our full potential. And we all have so much more in terms of wisdom and resource than we ever dream that we do. And so really like tapping into our actual potential to make change within whatever space we have access to.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Yay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Samia. Thank you, Ace. Drinking my water here. Water, so good.
I love your commitment to hydration, Nikki.
I also took some meds and some supplements and vitamins this morning, and ate my phallic bagel dog thing, you know, so all is great. Some of you missed that. It's too bad for you. Anyway, so I just want to thank you. This conversation will exist. We'll be captioning it and posting it on our YouTube, where all of our videos are captioned, closed captioned. So we'll be doing that in the next couple of days. So this will exist. We'll be having a follow-up to this conversation in the next couple of weeks, probably early June. But watch out on our social media, all of our social media, for more information about that. We are gathering some incredible people from all over the place to talk more about radical self-care. And in the meanwhile, if you have questions, if you have comments, feel free to reach out to Black and Pink on any of our social, and we can get them to Ace and Samia as well, to continue those conversations as part of community care. If you are white and or cis like me and you enjoyed this conversation, we highly encourage you to donate at Black and Pink. Just go to our website, go to the donate, $5, whatever, to continue to allow us to do some amazing work for system impacted folks, trans and queer folks, folks living with HIV. And I think that's it for now. Keep watching social media stuff. We post all the time what we're doing and what we're up to, and we are so grateful that you all joined us today. And again, thank you to Samia and Ace for this incredible conversation. It was just listening was healing for me. And so I'm super grateful to the both of you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Nikki.
Thanks, everybody.